दिन तुम कहाँ रहे, हाँ इतने दिन तुम कहाँ रहे। एक दिन भी ऐसा न गया मैंने तुझे याद ना किया हो। हाँ एक दिन भी ऐसा न गया मैंने तुझे याद ना किया हो। एक पल भी ऐसा न रहा तेरा दर्द ना लिया हो। जाने मन अब मुझसे दूर ना जाना।
कितने दिनों के बाद मिले हो जरा बताओ मुझे सनम।
कितने दिनों के बाद मिले हो पूछ रहा है ये मौसम।
कितने दिन तुम कहाँ रहे,
हाँ इतने दिन तुम कहाँ रहे।
मेरी तो सुबह और शाम तेरे इंतजार में कटी है। मेरी तो सुबह और शाम तेरे इंतजार में कटी है। तन्हा जुदाई की घड़ी तेरे हंसी प्यार में कटी है। साथिया फिर मुझे यूं ना कर पाना।
कितने दिनों के बाद मिले हो पूछ रहा है ये मौसम।
कितने दिनों के बाद मिले हो जरा बताओ मुझे सनम।
इतने दिन तुम कहाँ रहे,
कितने दिन तुम कहाँ रहे,
हाँ 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 इतने दिन तुम कहाँ रहे।
कितने दिन तुम कहाँ
मिलने को दिल भी करेगा फरियाद। हाँ इस मुलाकात के बाद, हाँ इस मुलाकात के बाद
आएगी हर पल तुझे मेरी याद।
जान है, एक दूजे की पहचान है।
एक दिल है हम, एक जान है, एक दूजे की पहचान है।
आपास तेरा दीदार करूं, दिल में रख लो तुझे प्यार करूं।
मैं भी तुझसे इकरार करूं, तेरी चाहत पे एतबार करूं। तेरी चाहत पे एतबार करूं।
आएगी हर पल तुझे मेरी याद। हाँ इस मुलाकात के बाद,
हाँ इस मुलाकात के बाद आएगी हर पल तुझे मेरी याद। कुछ पाना है, कुछ खोना है, मिलके न जुदा अब होना है।
कुछ पाना है, कुछ खोना है, मिलके न जुदा अब होना है।
एक पल जी ले, एक पल मर ले, आजा मिलके वादा कर ले।
दुनिया में जब तक होंगे हम, तोड़ेंगे ना उल्फत की कसम। तोड़ेंगे ना हम उल्फत की कसम।
आएगी हर पल तुझे मेरी याद। आएगी हर पल तुझे मेरी याद। हाँ इस मुलाकात के बाद, हाँ इस मुलाकात के बाद
मिलने को दिल भी करेगा फरियाद। मिलने को दिल भी करेगा फरियाद। हाँ इस मुलाकात के बाद, हाँ इस मुलाकात के बाद
आएगी हर पल तुझे मेरी याद।
आएगी हर पल तुझे मेरी याद। चोरी चोरी दिल तेरा चुराएंगे, अपना तुझे हम बनाएंगे। धीरे धीरे पास तेरे आएंगे, आके दूर फिर न जाएंगे।
चोरी चोरी दिल तेरा चुराएंगे, अपना तुझे हम बनाएंगे। धीरे धीरे पास तेरे आएंगे, आके दूर फिर न जाएंगे।
धड़कनों से तुझे चुराएंगे, अपना तुझे हम बनाएंगे। चोरी चोरी दिल तेरा चुराएंगे, अपना तुझे हम बनाएंगे।
धीरे धीरे पास तेरे आएंगे, आके दूर फिर न जाएंगे।
मिटाए हैं यूं करीब आए हैं, खिल रही है हर तरफ वफा की चांदनी। चांदनी से तुझे चुराएंगे, अपना तुझे हम बनाएंगे। चोरी चोरी दिल तेरा चुराएंगे, अपना तुझे हम बनाएंगे।
धीरे धीरे पास तेरे आएंगे, आके दूर फिर न जाएंगे। तुझको ही चाहूंगी,
मैं तुझको दुल्हन बना के संग ले जाऊंगा, तेरे नाज उठाऊंगा।
मेहंदी प्यार की रचाएंगे, अपना तुझे हम बनाएंगे। चोरी चोरी दिल तेरा चुराएंगे, अपना तुझे हम बनाएंगे।
धीरे धीरे पास तेरे आएंगे, आके दूर फिर न जाएंगे।
North Koreans weeping and wailing, collapsing in mourning after learning of the death of Kim Jong-il.
This reaction may seem extreme to you, but to the people of North Korea, they were mourning their god. North Korea, the tiny isolated country with the capabilities of mass destruction. With hostile relations in the West and increasing tension, will the Kim dynasty survive? The civilians adore and worship their communist dictator. Or is this all a show? From the country's founding in 1948 to the modern-day totalitarian regime, this is the entire history of North Korea. The birth of North Korea, 1946 to 1953. Japanese-occupied Korea. The entire Korean peninsula was under Japanese occupation after 1905. Japan's occupation was unquestioned by foreign powers, and it presented its occupation as a civilizing project. For the Koreans, the story was quite the opposite. Thousands of guerrilla fighters bitterly resisted Japan until 1910, when they were all but destroyed and Korea became fully part of the Japanese Empire. The story of Japanese-occupied Korea is one shared by many colonies. Industrialization and economic expansion came with discrimination against the native peoples, as wealth and resources were siphoned away to the imperial masters. The initial guerrilla resistance was over, but the resentment of the Koreans did not go away. Japan ran Korea like a military colony, with armed teachers in schools and a massive militarized police force overseeing all aspects of life. Also, like many colonies, they longed for independence. With the end of the First World War and all its promises of freedom, Korea agitated for its independence. Protests swept the nation in 1919, which the Japanese put down brutally. In one case, they locked hundreds of protesters inside a church and burned them alive. However, the tide couldn't be stemmed. The wave of Korean nationalism rose, and at its head were the communists. The rise of Korean communism. Communist movements were common across the world in the early 19th century. Galvanized by the success of Vladimir Lenin in the Russian Revolution, the communists promised wealth redistribution, an end to profit-seeking and imperialism, and a new prosperous beginning for its people. Time would put those promises to the test, but the dream of the communist utopia enchanted countless people, especially in Korea. Korean communists quickly became the tip of the anti-Japanese spear. Numerous guerrilla and civil groups emerged in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, trying to achieve an independent communist Korea. The Japanese responded with firing squads, prison time, and terror. This killed many guerrillas and forced others to flee, including a young man the world would come to know as Kim Il-sung. The rise of Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung was born in 1912 near Pyongyang. His early life is drowned in later propaganda, but it seems he was raised by Christian parents who escaped into China when he was still a child after getting involved in anti-Japanese activity. In China, young Kim fell in love with communist ideas. China had its own active communist movements, which Kim joined as soon as he was able. In 1931, he became a card-carrying member of the Chinese Communist Party and got involved with anti-Japanese protests and militant action. When Japanese forces invaded Manchuria in 1931, Kim joined the resistance, hoping to drive Japan out of China and eventually his homeland. Kim proved to be a successful guerrilla leader. He quickly worked his way up the ranks with successful strike after successful strike, operating in both China and Korea. In 1937, he led 200 guerrillas in the Battle of Pochanbo, just across the Korean border, where his forces defeated Japanese soldiers and burned down a police station and other occupied buildings. The victory put Kim Il-sung on the map and made him one of the most famous guerrilla leaders in East Asia. For later North Korean propaganda, it was the true start of Kim's path to power. Kim himself wrote about the battle saying that, quote, "The flames over the night sky of Pochanbo in the fatherland heralded the dawn of the liberation of Korea, which had been buried in darkness." Kim and the Soviets. Kim's success earned him the nickname of the Tiger. The Japanese military sent out units to hunt him down and may have killed his secret first wife, which forced Kim to retreat into the Soviet Union, where he was officially enrolled in the Red Army and spent most of the Second World War in hiding. When the USSR declared war on Japan in 1945, Soviet armies marched into the Korean peninsula. Kim followed shortly after. At the same time, US forces landed in the south. After evicting the Japanese occupiers, the Allied powers decided to split Korea, much as they had done Germany. American officials chose the 38th parallel, a previously meaningless line on a map, as the boundary between the two occupied zones. This line, apparently chosen in half an hour by two random American colonels, would become one of the most important borders in the world for the next 80 years. Korea had no natural north-south division, and everyone wanted a united Korean peninsula, under their particular ideology, of course. The Soviets knew they would need a reliable Korean communist leader to achieve this, and Stalin personally chose the greatest of the Korean communist guerrillas for the job. In December 1945, Kim Il-sung became first secretary of the Communist Party of Korea, giving Kim power over his nation that he would hold for the next 50 years. The Kim deception? Kim had risen from lowly guerrilla fighter to leader of his nation, or had he? A bizarre conspiracy theory claims that the Kim Il-sung who entered North Korea in 1945 was not the same one who led the Battle of Pochanbo. According to this theory, after the real Kim Il-sung fled into the USSR, Stalin made him disappear like so many other communist figures who threatened his popularity. It sounds crazy, but a CIA investigation into the theory concluded that it was right. They believed that the Kim Il-sung in North Korea was a criminal who the Soviets blackmailed into assuming a false identity so they could manipulate him. A Soviet officer who worked with Kim also wrote privately that the later Kim was an imposter whose name was stolen from the famous guerrilla leader who had actually died years earlier. These days, historians think the theory is nonsense. Several people who knew Kim as a guerrilla confirmed that it was the same man. The CIA report had simply been wrong, which happens far more often than the CIA likes to admit. Still, it's not impossible that the entire Kim dynasty is built on a Soviet lie. A divided Korea. Kim the guerrilla and Kim the first secretary were probably the same, but no such unity existed for Korea itself. Under two contrasting governments, the Korean peninsula became a flashpoint for the new Cold War between communism and capitalism. In the south, General John R. Hodge ran the U.S. Army's military government of Korea, while Kim acted as the figurehead for a Soviet-backed government in the north. Historians have often overstated the power of the Soviets in the north. Modern scholars accept that after 1946, Kim Il-sung and the North Korean Workers' Party were leading the way in setting North Korean policy. Kim began a series of communistic reforms in his nation. In March 1946, he began seizing land from landlords without compensation and redistributing it to the people. remaking the North's economy in a matter of months with thousands of new small peasant holdings. He set out a 2-year economic plan to guide production and investment, relying on new levels of state control over the economy and a focus on heavy industry. All industry, banks, communications, and transport infrastructure was nationalized. And in July 1946, Kim introduced a sexual equality law that guaranteed equal working rights for women. The reforms were successful, and North Korea saw an incredible economic recovery in the first few years after 1945. Divided communists. All was not easy within North Korea, though. Different factions of communists threatened Kim's control, and each tried to push North Korea in their own direction. Kim's Kapsun, or guerrilla faction, held power for now. As the name implies, they were mostly made up of former guerrilla fighters whose effectiveness had earned the faith of Stalin. But Stalin's faith was awfully fragile. This made the Soviet Korean communists a particular threat. Made up of ethnic Koreans with Soviet citizenship, they leaned heavily towards Moscow. While they hadn't proven their effectiveness enough to earn Stalin's favor, the heavy involvement of the Soviets made them a risky rival for the young Kim regime. Then there was the Yunnan faction. This was a Chinese-aligned communist wing, most of its members being part of the CCP. After Mao's communists took power in China in 1949, the Yunnan faction became a potent threat to Kim's Korea-centric approach that threatened to pull North Korea towards Beijing. Last, there were the South Korean communists. Many had fled the South when the American troops arrived and made it their main goal to reunify the peninsula under communist rule. They were less of an immediate threat until reunification was achieved, but their leader, Park Han-young, was the closest thing Kim had to a rival. Park and Kim had both been invited to Moscow in 1946 for Stalin to judge which was the suitable leader. While Kim had won out, Park remained a force to be reckoned with. Foundation of KPA. Unsurprisingly, Kim anchored himself in the military. He'd been a guerrilla fighter for decades and made it a huge part of his ideology. So much so that the foundation date of his anti-Japanese guerrilla force, April 25th, became an annual holiday. This guerrilla force was officially transformed into the Korean People's Army, known as KPA, in February 1948. Conscription was in place from the outset, which meant that the KPA has always been a formidable force. Arming such a massive army was a tall order, but the USSR ensured that it was done by pouring weapons, tanks, planes, and artillery into North Korea. With huge numbers and modern equipment, the KPA was one of the most powerful military forces in the post-war world. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is born, 1948. Meanwhile, the newly formed United Nations tried and failed to settle the Korean Peninsula problem. The USSR opposed free elections and refused to cooperate with the UN, believing that they were puppets controlled by the US. The UN proceeded to hold elections only in the South, and on the 15th of August 1948, the Republic of Korea, that being South Korea, was born under the leadership of Syngman Rhee. As far as the UN was concerned, this was the only true Korean government. North Korea responded by writing their own constitution. On the 9th of September, they declared themselves as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as premier. North Korea, as we know it today, was finally here. The Korean War invasion. Almost immediately, Kim started planning the reunification of the peninsula. With most American troops withdrawing in June 1949 and the vastly superior northern military at his fingertips, it looked like an easy win. Communism had also seen a string of recent victories that boosted Kim's confidence too. The USSR detonated their first atomic bomb in August 1949, which ended America's unchallenged nuclear supremacy. In China, Mao's communists overthrew the Republican government and gave him another communist ally. Both Stalin and Mao threw their support behind an invasion, and Mao sent at least 50,000 men from the People's Liberation Army to support him, although Stalin was clear that he would not send in the Red Army. The South expected a war. There were several clashes in 1950 that proved hostility between the two Koreas. Then, on 25th of June 1950, North Korean tanks, planes, and infantry poured over the border in a massive assault. The Northern Army outnumbered the poorly equipped South 2-1, its Air Force by more than 10-1, and North Korea's almost 300 tanks met a grand total of 0 units of South Korean armor. South Korea utterly collapsed. Within 5 days, Kim controlled Seoul. Almost 80% of South Korea's army was captured, killed, or had deserted, and the tiny handful of US troops on the peninsula could do nothing but run in the face of the North's overwhelming advance. As they went, North Korean forces targeted ideological enemies in South Korea. Politicians, anti-communist intellectuals, and business leaders were systematically exterminated by the KPA. Kim Il-sung was beyond pleased. It appeared he'd won a great victory, but that euphoria was short-lived. The Korean War, US retaliation. The United Nations condemned the invasion immediately, and 2 days later, it approved a unified military response to the crisis. Naturally, the US took the lead. Washington was worried that the fall of Korea to communism would threaten Japan and cause a domino effect in the rest of Asia. General Douglas MacArthur, who'd led U.S. forces in the Pacific theater of World War II and currently oversaw U.S. forces in occupied Japan, was given overall command of the UN coalition forces. UN forces landed at Incheon on the 15th of September, 1950. In the largest amphibious assault since World War II, the UN attack shattered the KPA. The North Korean front collapsed, and tens of thousands of KPA soldiers were captured. The UN quickly retook Seoul, and by the end of September, had pushed back to the 38th parallel. By that point, most of North Korea's army had been killed or captured. In October, UN forces pushed into North Korea itself. Kim and his government were forced to flee, and Pyongyang fell to UN forces within weeks. What had looked like a victory was quickly becoming a total defeat. The Korean War, strategic bombing. For North Korea, the true story of the war was not on the front lines, but at home. As its armies collapsed, so too did any hope of controlling the air. UN-aligned air forces quickly established dominance in the skies above North Korea and used it to devastating effect. The US Air Force led a colossal bombing campaign that devastated North Korea's population and infrastructure. Entire cities were flattened. Villages were wiped off the map. Pyongyang was so badly bombed that not a single major building was left standing. The U.S. general in charge of the Air Forces said that, by October 1950, the Air Force stopped sending bombers out simply because there was nothing left to bomb. An estimated 80% or more of North Korea's buildings were flattened, as more explosives were dropped on North Korea than were dropped in the entire Pacific theater in World War II. Maybe 10% of the North Korean population was killed by the bombing. It is this experience, more than anything else, that shaped North Korean attitudes to the US after the war. Whatever ideological disagreements they might have, and whatever nonsense propaganda the regime puts out, it is the near total leveling of North Korea by US bombing that explains the sheer hatred for the USA that pervades the North Korean state and society. The Korean War, Chinese intervention. Things improved for North Korea when China stepped in. China had warned the UN forces not to get too close to its territory, and on the 25th of October 1950, they decided that enough was enough. Tens of thousands of Chinese troops burst across the border and surprise attacked the UN forces. The UN was caught unaware and retreated in the face of the sudden attack. Chinese and North Korean forces quickly recaptured Pyongyang. pushed the UN back over the 38th parallel, and even retook Seoul for a short period. Kim Il-sung's feelings were mixed. On the one hand, North Korea was back under his control, but the strength of the UN forces made reunification unlikely. Kim resented the loss of so many of his troops and the fact that China was doing most of the fighting. Furthermore, both Stalin and Mao blamed the KPA for being too incompetent to win and causing the war to spiral out of control. UN forces soon regrouped and pushed back. Seoul was retaken in March, its fourth and final conquest in less than a year, and once again it was the communists' turn to retreat north with thousands of their soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The UN reached the 38th parallel again in July 1951, and there, the war would stall for 2 brutal years. The Korean War, Stalemate, and Armistice. From July 1951 to July 1953, the Korean War was a stubborn stalemate that was as grueling and frustrating as the trenches of the First World War. Casualties continued on both sides, but no significant territory changed hands. After several failed attempts to negotiate, both sides finally came to an agreement on the 27th of July, 1953. It was not a peace treaty, but an armistice. Both sides agreed to halt military operations, release prisoners, and return the remains of the deceased. The armistice set up an internationally monitored demilitarized zone, the Korean DMZ, along the border to mark the boundary between the two nations. The war has been left unfinished ever since. Skirmishes and episodes of violence have broken out, but for the most part, North and South Korea have been locked in a tense standoff that has threatened to spill over into a devastating war at any moment for the last 70 years. The rebirth of North Korea, 1953 to 1970. North Korea emerged from the war a broken and battered nation. Its army was almost destroyed. Its cities were in ruins. Its population was exhausted and demoralized. Kim Il-sung and his regime now faced the monumental task of rebuilding their country and navigating the perilous Cold War world.